At 67 years old, Judith Callender had given Hugh everything. Her 20s, her 30s, her 40s, her 50s, the better part of her 60s. 45 years of showing up. 45 years of holding household together, managing his schedule, ironing his shirts, hosting his colleagues over dinner, and smiling until her face ached. She walked into that attorney's office on a gray Tuesday morning in October believing, without a single doubt, that she was about to hear the legal formality of a life well shared. Instead, she sat alone on one side of a long conference table while three people who had spent 4 decades making clear she was not family divided her life between them like a bill at a restaurant. The mansion gone. The accounts gone. The investments she had never once been allowed to see statements for gone. What Judith received was an old brass key, a handwritten address for a cabin in a town she had never heard of, and a paragraph in Hugh's will that described her 45 years of marriage in language you would use for a cleaning service. What Brock, Yvonne, and Dale did not know, what greed had made them completely blind to, was that Hugh had spent the better part of those 45 years building something they would never find, protecting something they could never touch, and leaving it all to the one person in his life he had never stopped loving. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Judith in Whitmore was 22 years old when she took the job at Callender & Associates, a mid-sized property law firm on the 4th floor of a glass building in Hartford, Connecticut. It was 1979. She wore a navy skirt she had pressed 3 times the night before and carried a second-hand briefcase that had nothing in it. The receptionist position paid $11,400 a year. Judith thought it was the luckiest break she'd ever caught. Hugh Callender was 44 and ran the firm with the kind of authority that didn't need to raise its voice. He was tall, silver at the temples, the sort of man who made rooms feel smaller just by being in them. His first wife, Carol, had died of a brain aneurysm 3 years earlier, leaving him with 3 children. Brock, who was 17 and already had his father's jaw and none of his patience. Yvonne, who was 14 and watched everything from across rooms with eyes that cataloged and judged. And Dale, who was 11 and said very little but missed nothing. Judith noticed Hugh the way you notice weather. He was simply there, filling the atmosphere. For the first 8 months, they spoke the way a boss and a receptionist speak. He thanked her. She set a course. He corrected a filing error once, gently, and she fixed it within the hour. She learned his coffee, black, no sugar, never from the machine down the hall, always from the place on Asylum Street. She learned that he preferred his messages in writing rather than spoken aloud, that he did not like being interrupted before 10 in the morning, and that he kept a photograph of his late wife in the left drawer of his desk and never once put it where anyone could see it. He asked her to dinner in April of 1980. She said yes before he'd finished the sentence. 6 months after that, he proposed in his kitchen on a Sunday morning while she was reading the newspaper and he was burning toast. He did not get down on one knee. He said, simply, that he thought they should get married and that he hoped she agreed. She looked up from the paper and said she did. The ring came 3 days later, chosen without her. She wore it anyway and loved it completely. The wedding was small. Hugh's idea. His children were present because they had to be, not because they wanted to be. Brock wore a tie that was slightly crooked and spent the reception talking to nobody. Yvonne sat next to her grandmother and stared at Judith with an expression that a 15-year-old girl wearing yellow dress had no business knowing how to make. Dale ate 2 pieces of cake and asked if they were moving houses. Hugh told him no. Dale seemed both relieved and disappointed. You understand this doesn't change anything, Yvonne said to Judith at some point during the evening in the flat, pleasant tone of someone stating weather conditions. For us, I mean, you're not our mother. Judith said she understood. She did not fully understand until years later how completely Yvonne had meant it. The house you brought her into was a federal-style colonial in West Hartford for bedrooms, a garden that had gone to seed in the 3 years since Carol died, hardwood floors that needed refinishing, a kitchen that was perfectly functional and had not been updated since 1971. Judith refinished the floors herself over 2 weekends. She hired no one. She replanted the garden the following spring, starting from bare soil and a book she bought at a nursery on the Berlin Turnpike. By June of their first year, she had climbing roses on the back fence and herbs in 4 clay pots on the kitchen windowsill. By the following spring, she had a vegetable garden running along the south-facing wall that produced more tomatoes than 2 people could eat. Hugh told her she had a gift for making things grow. It was one of the kindest things he ever said to her, and she remembered it for the rest of her life. The stepchildren adjusted to her presence the way a body adjusts to a splinter, not by accepting it, but by growing around it. Brock left for college the year after the wedding and came home at Christmas and spring breaks, treating the house like a hotel where the staff happened to share his last name. Yvonne was colder and more deliberate, the kind of teenager who makes her feelings known through silence and the precise withdrawal of small courtesies. She stopped saying good morning. She stopped asking Judith to pass things at dinner. She addressed her father directly about everything and acknowledged Judith only when absolutely required. Dale was the easiest, which wasn't saying much. He was simply absent in the way shy children are, present at the table, gone in every way that counts. Judith cooked for them. She remembered their birthdays without being asked. She attended Yvonne's school play in November of 1981 and sat 3 rows behind Hugh because Yvonne had said, very quietly, that she would rather Judith not sit with them. Hugh had nodded and said nothing to either of them about it afterward. Judith found her own seat, watched the play, and drove herself home. She had told herself, then, that it would get easier. Children grow. Wounds heal. Given enough time and enough dinners and enough remembered birthdays, she would become, if not loved, at least accepted. She believed this with the particular determination of someone who has decided that trying harder is the only option available. She would spend the next 4 decades discovering how wrong she was. What she could not see yet, what she would not understand until she was standing in a small cabin in the woods of northern Vermont at 67 years old, holding a letter written in her husband's handwriting, was that while she had been trying to earn a place in Hugh's family, Hugh had been quietly, carefully, and with considerable legal ingenuity building her way out. He just hadn't told her. And the reason he hadn't told her was the same reason for everything in this story. Brock, Yvonne, and Dale were always watching. The marriage had a shape to it that took Judith years to name. From the outside, it looked complete. Hugh was never cruel, never loud, never the kind of man who slammed doors or said things he couldn't take back. He provided. He remembered their anniversary. He sat across from her at dinner most nights and talked about his cases, his clients, the slow grind of property law in a state where everyone seemed to own land they were fighting over. He was attentive in the careful way of a man who had learned to maintain a household the way you maintain machinery, with regular attention and genuine competence, but without the particular warmth that makes a house feel like it belongs to both people equally. There was always a part of Hugh that stayed just out of reach. He kept his finances private from the first month of their marriage and never made it feel like a secret. It was framed as practicality. He had accounts from before they met, trusts connected to the firm, investments that predated her by 20 years and were, he said, simply easier to leave as they were. She would want for nothing. The household account was generous. If she needed anything, she had only to ask. She never needed anything she couldn't justify. She was not a woman who spent money on herself easily, a habit she had grown up with and never lost. So the arrangement sat between them, unremarked on, a closed door that neither of them tried very hard to open. Once, in their 4th year of marriage, she had asked to see the tax returns. She had framed it carefully, not as suspicion, but as wanting to feel like a full participant in the life they were building. Hugh had looked at her across the kitchen table and said, with complete gentleness, that he handled all of that and she didn't need to worry. He said the way you tell a child the stove is hot, not unkindly, just with a finality that made further questions feel unreasonable. She did not ask again. She built her life inside the perimeter he'd drawn and made it as full as she could. The garden expanded year by year. She took a ceramics class in 1987 and became, to her own surprise, quite good at it. She volunteered at the West Hartford Library every Thursday morning for 11 years. She learned to make bread from scratch, then pasta, then pastry. She read 2 books a week and kept a journal she filled from cover to cover twice a year. She had friends, women she'd met through the library, through the ceramic studio, through the slow accumulation of years, and she genuinely liked them. Her life, viewed from any angle but the one she occupied, appeared to be a good one. The trouble was the stepchildren as adults, which turned out to be considerably worse than the stepchildren as children. Brock graduated from law school in 1987 and joined a firm in Boston. He had his father's aptitude for property law and none of his father's reserve. He was the kind of man who spoke over people without meaning to because it genuinely did not occur to him that the other person might not be finished. He came home for Christmas and Thanksgiving and treated the West Hartford house with the proprietary ease of someone who had never once considered it might not be entirely his. He went through cupboards. He rearranged the garage once without mentioning it. He called Judith by her first name and managed, consistently, to make it sound like a category rather than a name. Yvonne had become something harder to read than simple hostility. She had married in 1990, divorced in 1995, remarried in 1999, and her personal life had the restless quality of someone always arriving somewhere and never quite settling. She worked in finance, also in Boston, and was sharply intelligent in a way that sometimes goes wrong when it never gets properly humbled. She stopped being openly cold to Judith somewhere in her late 20s and replaced it with something more sophisticated, a studied neutrality that acknowledged Judith's presence without ever conceding her legitimacy. She was never rude. She was simply elsewhere, in every sense that mattered. Dale had turned out to be the gentlest of the three, which was not saying much. He lived in Portland, worked in tech, called his father every Sunday. And when he came home, he was pleasant to Judith in a distracted way, like someone being pleasant to a neighbor they can't quite place. He did not dislike her. He had simply never found a reason to know her, and after 30 years the not knowing had set into something that couldn't easily be moved. What all three of them shared was the understanding, maintained across 4 decades with the consistency of people who have made a private agreement, that Judith was temporary. She was the woman their father had married. She ran the house and attended the events and stood in the photographs. She was not family, and when their father died, that distinction would matter. They were correct about one thing. The distinction mattered enormously. They were wrong about everything else. Hugh Callender died on a Wednesday morning in September, in the bedroom he had shared with Judith for 45 years, with a window open and the sound of her garden coming through it. She had been downstairs making coffee. By the time she brought it up, he was gone. The cup sat on a nightstand for 3 hours before she thought to take it away. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The funeral was held on a Saturday at a church in West Hartford that Hugh had attended twice a year for most of his adult life. Christmas and Easter, reliably, the way men of his generation practiced religion, as a habit rather than a conviction. 500 people came anyway. Property law touches a lot of lives over 50 years of practice, and Hugh Callender had been one of the best in Connecticut. Judges came. Former clients came. 3 men who had opposed him in court for decades came and stood in line to pay their respects, which said something about the kind of opponent he had been. Judith sat in the front pew. That lasted until 40 minutes before the service began, when Brock arrived with his wife and their 2 teenage sons and informed Judith, in a low voice that managed to be both apologetic and completely unyielding, that the family would need that row. Extended family was coming. His aunt, Hugh's sister Miriam, his aunt, Hugh's college friend's widow. There were people with a genuine claim to the front. Judith would be more comfortable in the second row, just behind. She'd still be able to see and hear everything perfectly. She moved to the second row. She sat there for 2 hours while speaker after speaker rose to describe Hugh Callender, the attorney, the father, the pillar, the man whose handshake meant something. Nobody mentioned the woman who had brought him coffee every morning for 45 years. Nobody mentioned the garden or the bread or the 11 years of Thursday mornings at the library that she had given up when Hugh's health began declining and he needed someone at home. Nobody said the word wife. At the reception, held afterward at Brock's house in Simsbury. Judith stood near the food table for a while and then migrated toward a corner near the window that looked out over a yard where Hugh's grandchildren were chasing each other between the oak trees. She watched them and drank a glass of wine and spoke to the few people who sought her out. Hugh's longtime paralegal, a woman named Patricia who had worked for him for 22 years and who hugged Judith and cried openly. A retired judge who had known Hugh since law school and who held both of Judith's hands and said he was so sorry, so very sorry, and meant it in a way she could feel. She overheard Yvonne near the kitchen doorway, speaking to a cluster of her college friends who had come up from New York. "The estate is substantial," Yvonne was saying, keeping her voice at a register calculated to carry to exactly the people she wanted and no further. Dad was always very clear about where his priorities were. His children, his real family. "I don't anticipate any complications." Her real family. Judith set down her wine glass, found her coat on the rack by the front door, and drove home alone through October dark. She sat in the kitchen for an hour with the lights off, and then went to bed in the room she had shared with Hugh for 45 years and stared at the ceiling until somewhere around 3 in the morning, when she finally slept. The will reading was scheduled for the following Thursday at the offices of Edwin Hartley, who had handled Hugh's estate planning for the better part of 15 years. Judith had met Edwin perhaps 4 times at firm events. He was a precise, careful man in his late 50s who wore bow ties and expressed himself in measured sentences that never wasted a word. She had always found him reassuring in the abstract way that competent professionals are reassuring. Walking into his conference room that Thursday morning, she was considerably less reassured. Brock had brought his personal attorney. So had Yvonne. Dale had come alone, but sat close to his siblings in a way that made the geometry of the room immediately legible. Judith sat across from all 3 of them with her hands folded on the table and told herself there was no reason for the cold that had started in her chest and was working its way outward. Edwin began with the formalities. The estate's total assessed value was approximately $9.2 million. This included the West Hartford property, valued at $2.4 million. Investment accounts totaling $5.1 million. Retirement accounts of $1.4 million. Various other holdings bringing the remainder. The West Hartford property, Edwin continued, was left in its entirety to Hugh's children from his first marriage, Brock, Yvonne, and Dale Callender, to be divided or sold at their discretion. The cold in Judith's chest reached her hands. The investment accounts, similarly, were left in equal portions to the 3 children. The retirement accounts, same distribution. Judith heard herself ask, very quietly, what Hugh had left for her. Edwin looked at her with an expression she would remember for a long time. Not pity exactly, but the look of a man who has been required to deliver information he finds genuinely distasteful and is doing so because his professional obligations demand it. He read from the document directly. Hugh had written that Judith had enjoyed 45 years of financial security, social standing, and domestic comfort that she could not have achieved independently. That this constituted fair and reasonable compensation for her companionship and her management of the household. That his primary obligation, in death as in life, was to his bloodline. He left for one thing, a property he owned at 14, Birch Hollow Lane in the town of Stonewick, Vermont, along with all its contents, along with a brass key and a handwritten note. The note said, "Go there, Judith. Go as soon as you can. You will understand everything when you arrive. I am sorry it had to be this way. All my love, always. Hugh." The 30 days that followed were the kind that leave marks. Brock called the morning after the will reading. He was pleasant about it in the way that made pleasantness feel like a threat. He wanted Judith to know that the family understood this was a difficult time, that they had no desire to make things harder than they needed to be, that the will specified 30 days for her to arrange her affairs and vacate the West Hartford property, and they intended to honor that completely, but that they would also be bringing in a real estate agent that week to begin the assessment process, since the market in that neighborhood moved quickly and they didn't want to lose the season. He hoped she understood. She understood. The agent came 2 days later, a brisk woman in her 40s named Karen who walked through the house with a tablet and spoke to Brock on the phone while standing in rooms Judith was still living in. She noted that the kitchen would need updating before listing. She suggested the master bedroom furniture was dated. She stood in the back doorway, looking at the garden Judith had spent 30 years building, and told Brock that professional landscaping would be needed to bring it up to current buyer expectations, that the beds were overgrown and the overall effect was a little wild for the price point they were targeting. A little wild. Judith was sitting at the kitchen table 8 feet away when Karen said it. She did not respond. She had spent 45 years not responding, and the habit held even now. Even here, even when what she wanted to do was ask Karen if she had any idea how many hours of her own life were buried in that garden. How many springs? How many early mornings with her knees in the soil and her hands in the cold ground, coaxing things into growing? She didn't ask. She poured herself a cup of coffee and looked out the window at the roses on the back fence, which were her roses, which had been her roses for 30 years, and which would belong to someone else in a matter of weeks. Yvonne came on a Wednesday with a woman she introduced as her interior designer. They moved through the house with the easy authority of people who have already decided something and are simply confirming measurements. Yvonne pointed at walls, and the designer nodded and tapped things in her phone. They discussed opening up the first floor into a single flowing space. They discussed replacing the hardwood floors Judith had refinished herself with engineered oak in a lighter tone. At one point, Yvonne stood in the doorway of the room Judith had used as a small studio for her ceramics work. The wheels still in the corner, a row of glazed bowls on the shelf she had made over the past 3 years, and said to the designer that this would make a good home office once it was cleared out. Once it was cleared out. As though Judith's work were clutter. As though 30 years of learning a craft were an inconvenience to be removed before the real use of the room could begin. Dale came once, briefly, on a Saturday afternoon. He was less pointed than his siblings, less architectural in his cruelty. He sat in the kitchen and drank the coffee Judith made him and asked vague questions about how she was doing with all of this. When she said it was hard, he nodded with genuine seeming sympathy and said he imagined it must be. He did not say anything about the will. He did not say anything about the 30 days. He finished his coffee and said he had to get back and hug her at the door, a real hug, the kind that made it worse rather than better because it suggested he was capable of more than he ever chose to give. The nights were the worst part, not because of fear, though fear was there, spreading through her chest in the dark hours like water through a crack. The worst part was the silence. 45 years of a person in the house, his reading glasses on the nightstand, his shoes by the door, the particular weight of another body in a bed, and then nothing. Just the house, which was no longer hers, ticking around her in the dark. She packed slowly and methodically. 3 suitcases of clothing, 2 boxes of things that were genuinely hers, photographs from before the marriage, letters from her mother, a few books, the best of the ceramics work that would survive being moved. The garden she could not pack, that she left behind and try not to think too hard about. On the 28th day, she was in the kitchen washing dishes when she heard Brock and Yvonne talking in the dining room with the same 2 rooms away volume people use when they want to be overheard just enough to sting without being accountable for it. Yvonne was saying that the Stonewick property was almost certainly worth nothing. A cabin in a town that small, in that condition. She'd looked it up, and the assessed value on the county records was $48,000, which barely covered a year of property taxes on the West Hartford house. It was charity, really, their father's way of easing his conscience without it actually costing anything. Brock laughed, a short, clean laugh with no discomfort in it all. Judith finished the dishes. She dried her hands on the kitchen towel, folded it over the oven handle the way she had done 10,000 times, and walked out of the kitchen without saying a word. She had $30 in her wallet, a brass key, and an address in Vermont. She left on day 30 at 7 in the morning before any of them arrived. She had never been to Stonewick. She had never heard of Stonewick before the will reading, which was a strange thing to sit with on a 4-hour drive north into Vermont in the last week of October. 45 years of marriage to a man who had apparently been making monthly trips to a town she had never once heard him mention. All those weekends he said he needed to decompress. All those Friday evenings he left with a single bag and came back Sunday nights quieter and somehow easier in himself. She had always assumed it was a property he managed, or simply the solitude that some people need and that she had learned not to question. The GPS took her off the interstate at White River Junction and onto smaller roads, then smaller still, until she was on Tulane blacktop winding through hills thick with maple and birch, the leaves past their peak but still holding enough color to make the landscape look like something lit from inside. Her back ached from the car, and her eyes felt dry, and she was aware, distantly, of how precarious the whole situation was. 67 years old, driving alone toward a property she had never seen in a town she had never heard of, with $30 and a brass key and absolutely no plan beyond arriving. She came into Stonewick just before noon. It was smaller than she had expected, and she had expected small. A single main street with maybe a dozen buildings clustered around a square where an old maple tree, enormous, probably 150 years old, dropped leaves onto a wooden bench in the weak October sun. A general store with a hand-painted sign. A diner called Pierce's with a cardboard pie illustration in the window. A post office the size of a large closet. A white clapboard church. A library that looked like it had been a house first and a library second, which was probably exactly what it was. She drove slowly down the main street and noticed, with a feeling she couldn't quite name, the people looked up. The man sweeping the front step of the general store paused and watched her pass. A woman coming out of the diner with a paper cup stopped on the sidewalk and looked at Judith's car with an expression that was less curiosity than recognition. Two teenagers on the library steps lifted their eyes from their phones, which in Judith's experience was not a thing teenagers did for just any passing car. She followed the GPS down a road that turned from pavement to packed gravel after about a quarter mile, running between stone walls and through stands of birch that filtered the midday light into long, thin strips across the hood of her car. The road climbed slightly, then leveled, then ended at a gate that was standing open, as though someone had recently been through it or was expecting her. She pulled through and stopped. The cabin sat in a clearing ringed by old maples, 4 of them with trunks so wide she couldn't have gotten her arms around them. It was built from squared logs, dark with age and weatherproofing, with a steep metal roof that had shed the leaves cleanly and a covered porch running the full width of the front. The windows were large for a building that old, 12-pane divided lights that caught the October sky and reflected it back in rectangles of pale blue and gray. A stone chimney rose from the center of the roof, solid and straight, with no lean in it at all. It was not falling down. It was not a ruin. It was not the worthless dump Brock and Yvonne had assumed it was from a county records search. It was in fact beautiful, not showy, not the kind of beautiful that announces itself, the kind that takes a moment to arrive, the way it does with things that were made carefully and have lasted a long time because of it. The log walls had the silver-brown patina of very old wood that had been properly maintained. The porch was level. The steps were solid. Someone had stacked a cord of firewood along the left wall with the precision of a person who takes that kind of thing seriously. She sat in the car for a long moment looking at it. Then she heard footsteps on the gravel behind her and turned to see a woman walking toward the car from the direction of the road, moving with the purposeful ease of someone who knows exactly where she is going and has been there before. She was somewhere in her late 60s, solidly built, wearing a canvas jacket over a flannel shirt and carrying a wicker basket with a cloth over the top. She stopped beside Judith's window. Judith rolled it down. "You're Judith," the woman said. "Not a question," said the way you greet someone you've been waiting for. "Yes," Judith said. "I'm up Pierce. I run the diner in town." She held up the basket. "Soup, bread, a piece of pie. Figured you wouldn't have had time to eat properly." She glanced at the cabin and then back at Judith. "Hugh told us you'd come eventually." Set a watch for a woman in a gray Honda who'd looked like she'd been through something and needed a hot meal. She paused. He wasn't wrong about any of that. Judith looked at the woman, then at the cabin, then back at Doc. "How long have you known about this place?" she asked. Doc considered the question with the care of someone choosing words that have weight. "About 38 years, she said. "Come on, I'll help you get the door open." The brass key turned in the lock without any resistance at all, which surprised Judith. She had expected the stiffness of a lock that hadn't been used, the grinding protest of old mechanisms. Instead, the door opened smoothly and cleanly, as though someone had oiled it recently. Because someone had. Dot told her, matter-of-factly, that a man from town, named Gus Pelletier, came up twice a year to handle maintenance. The lock, the weather stripping, the gutters, the roof, if anything needed attention. Hugh had arranged it through the local bank and paid it forward in a trust that covered the next 40 years of upkeep. Gus had been doing it since 1991. Judith stepped inside. The main room was large for a cabin, maybe 30 feet across, with wide plank pine, floors the color of old honey that caught the afternoon light coming through the south-facing windows. A stone fireplace filled most of the east wall, built from the same field stone as the chimney, with a mantle of rough-hewn oak above it, and a cast-iron wood stove insert that Dot said threw enough heat to warm the whole ground floor in 15 minutes flat. The furniture was simple, a sofa in worn brown leather, 2 armchairs positioned toward the fire, a long oak table near the windows that could have seated 8. Bookshelves along the north wall, floor to ceiling, filled with books that had clearly been read rather than collected. A kitchen at the back, small and functional, with a deep farmhouse sink and copper pots on hooks, and a gas range that looked newer than everything else. All of that she took in quickly. What stopped her was the walls. Every available surface that wasn't a window or a bookshelf held a framed photograph. Dozens of them, in frames of different sizes and different woods, hung with the care of a private exhibition. And every photograph was of Judith. Judith in the garden of the West Hartford house, kneeling in the soil in the early spring with dirt on her gloves and her hair loose. Judith at the kitchen table with a book, her reading glasses pushed up on her head, laughing at something just out of frame. Judith walking down a street, in autumn with her coat collar turned up, not aware she was being photographed, just walking alive in an ordinary moment that someone had thought worth keeping. Judith at her ceramics wheel, hands wet, eyes down, entirely absorbed. Judith asleep on a porch she didn't recognize. This porch, she realized slowly. This cabin's porch. At some point Hugh had brought her here. She had no memory of it. Then she looked more carefully and realized from the quality of the light and the color of her hair that the photograph was at least 25 years old. She must have been 40, perhaps 42. Asleep in the Vermont afternoon, while Hugh sat somewhere nearby with a camera and decided that this was a moment worth recording. She stood in the middle of the room and couldn't speak. Dot came in behind her, set the basket on the kitchen counter, and said nothing for a long moment. Then, quietly, he called this place the Keep. Said it was where he kept what mattered. Judith's eyes were full. She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth and breathed through it. He came every month, Dot said. Sometimes more. He'd stop in at the diner first thing, have coffee, we'd talk. He talked about you constantly. What you were reading. What you planted that season. Something you'd said that made him laugh. She moved to the kitchen and began unpacking the basket without making a production of it. Lifting the cloth, setting the soup container on the stove, cutting the bread on the board she found in the second drawer without needing to look. He said you were the only person who had ever loved him for the right reasons, and that he'd spent 40 years failing to protect you from his own children. He could have just told them to stop, Judith said. Her voice came out uneven. He knew that. He told me he knew that. Dot lit the burner under the soup and turned to face her. He said he was a coward about it, that he could handle any opposing attorney in any courtroom in Connecticut, but he couldn't look his own children in the eye and tell them they were wrong. He called it the great failure of his life. She paused. His words. He used them more than once. Judith looked around the room again. All those photographs. All those frames. All those ordinary moments of her life. Harvested quietly by a man who apparently loved her in ways he never quite managed to say out loud while she was paying attention. There's a study, said. Through that door under the stairs. He told me that when you arrived, and after you'd had time to take the place in, I should point you toward the study. He left something on the desk for you. He was very specific about the order of things. Soup first, he said. A small smile. He said you'd try to skip straight to the desk, and that I should not let you. Judith almost laughed. That sounds exactly like him, she said. It does, Dot agreed, and ladled the soup into a bowl she found without asking where anything was, because she had clearly been in this kitchen before, many times, over many years. Sit down, Judith. Eat something. The desk will still be there in 20 minutes. Judith sat. She ate the soup, which was potato and leek and very good, and she looked at the photographs of herself on the walls of a cabin she had never known existed, and she let herself cry, quietly, without trying to stop it. The study was exactly as Dot had described it. A small room off the main hallway. No windows, built-in shelves on 3 walls running floor to ceiling, and a mahogany desk centered against the 4th wall with a green-shaded lamp and a leather chair worn smooth at the armrest from years of use. The shelves held labeled binders and document boxes arranged with the precision of a man who had spent 50 years in a profession where misfiled papers had consequences. And sitting in the exact center of the desk, positioned with obvious intent, was a cream-colored envelope. On the front, in Hugh's handwriting, for Judith. Everything you need to know. She sat in a chair. She picked up the envelope. She broke the seal. There were 6 pages inside, written by hand on the heavy cream stationery Hugh had used for important correspondence for as long as she had known him. The handwriting was his, careful, upright, the hand of a man who had learned penmanship when that still meant something and had never let it slip. "My dearest Judith," it began, "if you're reading this, then you have found the keep, and Dot has fed you, and you're sitting in my chair at my desk, and you're either furious with me, or you're beginning to understand, or possibly both at once, which is what I would deserve." She read slowly. He explained the cabin first. His uncle, a bachelor named Roy Callender who had died in 1986, had left it to him in a will that predated Judith's arrival in Hugh's life by nearly a decade. When Roy died, the cabin and its surrounding land came to Hugh clear of encumbrance, a gift from a man who had lived simply and left what he had to the only nephew who ever visited him. Hugh had driven up to see it the autumn of the year Roy died, intending to assess whether to sell it. He had sat on the porch for 2 hours in the October cold and decided he could not. He had been coming ever since. He had not told Judith, he wrote, for a reason that was entirely about Brock, Yvonne, and Dale. From the first year of their marriage, it had been apparent to him that his children regarded anything he possessed as belonging, in some future sense, to them. He had watched Brock begin to speak about the West Hartford house with possessive familiarity before their first anniversary. He had seen Yvonne ask questions about his accounts in a tone that was less curiosity than inventory. He had understood, slowly and with considerable sadness, that if his children knew about the cabin and the land, they would find legal means to challenge it. He was a property attorney. He knew exactly how it would be done. So he kept the cabin separate, transferred the deed to Judith's name alone in the first year of their marriage, structured it as a gift entirely outside the marital estate, and said nothing to anyone except Roy's old solicitor and, eventually, he wrote about the land next. 212 acres of Vermont woodland, surveyed the previous spring. A conservation trust in Burlington had expressed formal interest in purchasing the development rights at a price he named in the letter, a number that made Judith sit very still and read it twice. The cabin itself had been appraised at just over $900,000 as a historic structure. Sell, keep, or do anything in between, the decision was entirely hers. The deed was in the top left drawer. Her name on it since 1987, legally untouchable by anyone. He wrote about the filing cabinets, 3 of them, gray steel, labeled in his hand. The first held property documentation, trust instruments, maintenance fund records. The second held case notes and correspondence from 50 years of legal practice, most of it mundane, some of it not. The third he addressed most carefully. It held files on Brock, Yvonne, and Dale. Financial records, personal documents, information gathered across decades of keeping his eyes open the way lawyers do. He had never used any of it, he wrote. She should not either unless she had no other choice. But she should know it existed. If any of them came to Stonewick looking for a fight, she was not without options. He wrote about his failures last. The theater of the will, the deliberate cruelty of the language, had been calculated to satisfy his children so completely that they would not look further. Give them the visible wealth, and they would not search for the invisible kind. It had worked, because greed rarely looks past what it's already holding. But he knew how those words had landed. He knew because he knew her. and he needed her to understand that not one of those words reflected what she had been to him, what she had always been. The last paragraph was short. You were the best thing in my life, Judith. The most real thing. I was not brave enough to say it the way it deserved to be said, out loud, in rooms where it cost something. I am sorry for that. I hope this comes close to making it right. The keep is yours. It has been yours since before you knew it existed. That was always the point. All my love. All of it. Hugh. She read the letter twice. Then she folded it carefully and set it on the desk and sat in a chair in the quiet of his study for a long time, listening to the wind move through the maples outside and letting the full weight of 45 years rearrange itself into something she could begin to carry differently. The call from Edwin Hartley came 11 days after Judith arrived in Stonewick. He told her, without preamble, that Brock had retained a litigation attorney and was filing a challenge. The argument being that the Birch Hollow Lane property was a marital asset improperly excluded from the estate. Judith thanked him, went inside, and opened the top left drawer of Hugh's desk. The deed was exactly where Hugh had said, her name on it, dated March 1987. Structured as an outright gift predating any marital property classification by the full length of their marriage. She then opened the third filing cabinet, found a folder labeled Brock Callender, and read it for 30 minutes. Then she called Edwin back. She told him she had the original deed and all associated instruments, that she was prepared to contest the challenge fully, and that she had also become aware of certain financial records pertaining to Brock's real estate dealings over the past decade that might interest parties beyond this dispute if documents enter the public record. There was a pause. Edwin said he understood and would be in touch. The Mercedes arrived on a Thursday afternoon, 2 weeks later. All three of them got out, Brock first, Yvonne, then Dale hanging back as he always did. They stood in the clearing looking at the cabin with expressions that cycled through confusion, then recalculation, then something closer to unease as they understood that what they had dismissed as a worthless camp was none of those things. Judith opened the front door before they knocked. She made tea. She set cups on the oak table by the windows and sat at one end and gestured for them to sit. They did, because the room and her manner in it left them no real alternative. Brock said they had come to discuss the property situation. Judith said she imagined they had. The folder she left in front of herself. She did not open it. She rested her hand on top of it and looked at all three of them. She said she would not be meeting anyone halfway. The property was hers, had been hers for 38 years, and would remain so. If the legal challenge proceeded, everything in the folder and the two behind it would enter the public record, and she trusted each of them understood what that meant without her spelling it out. The room was quiet except for the wind in the maples and the tick of the wood stove. Dale spoke first. He looked at the table and said, quietly, that he thought they should go. They left without finishing their tea. The legal challenge was quietly withdrawn within a month. The West Hartford house sold after 7 months on the market, well below what Brock had predicted, slowed by the historical preservation requirements Hugh had built into the deed and a mortgage the children had not known about until closing. The three trusts proved exactly as complicated as Hugh had designed them. Brock's distributions gated behind employment verification, Yvonne's frozen pending a family stability review she had no realistic prospect of passing, Dale's requiring hands-on business management he had neither the time nor the inclination for. Edwin kept Judith informed. She was not sorry for any of them. She had decided, sometime in that first Vermont winter, that she had spent enough of her life managing feelings on behalf of people who had never once managed theirs on hers. Spring came to Stonewick the way it always does in northern Vermont, slowly, then all at once. Judith planted a kitchen garden along the sunny side of the cabin, starting from bare ground. By June, she had lettuce and herbs and tomatoes running along the east wall, and one morning kneeling in the cold soil, she noticed that she was happy. Not consoled, happy without qualification, in a way that needed no one's permission. She had joined the library committee in February and volunteered on Thursday mornings, which was how she met Ruth, who ran the Historical Society. She had supper at Dot's Diner on Tuesday evenings. She had unpacked her ceramics wheel and set it up in the back room, where the afternoon light was good. In January, she had found a second envelope in the bottom drawer of the desk, labeled for later. Inside was a deed to a small plot on the edge of town with a barn on it, and a note in Hugh's hand, for whatever you decide to make. It's a blank page, Judith. Fill it however you want. She planned to build a proper workshop, a kiln, a wheel, room for others who wanted it. She had been talking to a woman in town who taught weaving, and another who had spent 30 years as a watercolor painter without ever owning a real studio. There was something forming in those conversations, something that hadn't found its name yet, but had the weight of something real. Hugh had been a complicated man, flawed in the way of people who love well in private and fail in public, who find it easier to act than to speak, who build in secret what they cannot say out loud. But he had spent 38 years constructing her a way forward, patiently, quietly, without ever telling her it existed, and trusting, correctly, as it turned out, that she was strong enough to find it when the time came. That counted for quite a lot. She had decided it counted for nearly everything. By May, the maples had fully leafed out over the clearing, the canopy closing over the cabin roofed the way it must have closed for 100 years before she arrived. She sat on the porch some evenings after supper with a book she wasn't always reading. The light came through the leaves in the particular way it does in early summer in Vermont, green and shifting, and the wood of the porch was warm under her palms, and the air smelled of the garden she had planted along the east wall. She sat there and felt, for the first time in longer than she could honestly measure, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be, not where she had ended up, where she had always been headed, without knowing it, through every difficult year of a life that had turned out to be longer and stranger and more worth living than she had any right to expect at 67 years old, with a brass key and $30 and a dirt road leading north into the Vermont hills. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.